Hello, everyone, and welcome to another PropMoto Live webinar. As always, I will be your host. My name is Franco. I'm the co-founder and editor of PropMoto, and looking forward to a lively discussion about the fate of the office market, kind of the multi-billion-dollar question right now. Gonna wait a couple minutes until everybody gets in, gets seated, get some coffee, get some wine. I'm not gonna judge. Have some great panelists here that are all going to give some of their expert opinion about what they're seeing. And yeah, I think overall, we really want to focus on the strategies that are working, right? I think it's old news to say that the office market has changed post-pandemic. It seems like a long time since the pandemic has ended. And I think we're starting to kind of hit a stasis where we're starting to see what the future looks like. We're no longer kind of waiting for things to return, or I hear much less talk about comparing this to pre-pandemic levels. I think that's kind of a moot point at this point, right? Like we've all moved on, and the life has changed, and the way we use the office has changed, probably for good. And so we really want to focus on what's working, right? How occupiers are thinking about their office space, and how office owners, managers, and brokers are able to kind of bridge the gap between the office that we have and the office that everybody wants and deserves. So, obviously seen a lot of really, really great, names and companies in the sign up list. And as always, this is going to be open discussion. So is completely live. And so we are not going to wait until the end for any Q&A. We just ask that you go ahead and insert any questions you have right into the Q&A bar down at the bottom. And we'll answer them as they come along. I think that's one of my favorite things about this, honestly, is that we get a chance to not only kind of, weigh in on our opinion, what we're seeing, but answer some important questions and hear from all of you what you're seeing in the office market now. And obviously it's regionally there's just some differences. Office class level, there's some differences, and we'll get into all of that. But it takes all of us, I think, all of our eyes kind of on the horizon to really understand what this full scope of the change is when it comes to office occupiers and what they're looking for. So without further ado, I would love to introduce my expert panelists. The first one is Thru Shivakumar. She's CEO and co-founder of Cohesion. That's a tenant experience technology company. Hi, Thru. I think.
Hello, Franco. I'm on mute.
No problem. Next, I have Phil Mobley. He's the National Director of Office Analytics at a little company called CoStar. A lot of you have probably heard of. Hi, Phil.
Hey, Franco.
Thanks for joining. And last but not least, we have Michael Billing. He's Global Consulting Practice Lead for JLL, the global brokerage. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Franco. It's good to see everybody.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for joining. And yeah, to start, I don't want to spend too much time on this because, again, I want to get into the strategies, but I do think that it would be good to level set a little bit about where the market's at, right? And what everyone's seeing. And like I said, there's a lot of regional differences. There's a lot of kind of differences by, city centers, the suburbs, the quality of the office. But, in general, I just kind of want to hear from all of you about what you've seen insofar as what is still in demand when it comes to office product, and maybe which kind of products are struggling a little bit more. Phil, I know you have a pretty good bird's eye view of everything going on in the country with all the data that you guys sit on. So give me a little bit about what you're seeing so far.
Sure. Well, we're still really kind of in the middle of this shift in demand that I think it's safe to say is structural to a degree, that we saw really catalyze in 2020. The way we track vacancy, the national vacancy rate is approaching 14% now. 13.8 is the official number. And for a point of comparison, it was about 9.5 entering 2020. Now, if you look at a report that, Michael's company or one of the other brokerages might put out, you'll see a higher number than that. And that's for good reason. It's because the brokerages tend to track space that is competitive in the leasing market. So, for lease, multi-tenanted, major market property, and the vacancy rate in those properties is closer to 19 or 20%. But however you slice it, it's essentially an all-time high, depending on the market. Nationally, it's an all-time high. So, I mentioned we think we're still kind of in the middle of this, maybe 60 to 65% of the way through it. And that's just a function of how many of those pre-2020 executed leases are still out there. There's actually only about 20% of the leases themselves, but on a square footage basis, because larger leases tend to last longer. So there's almost half, 40 to 45% or so of the square footage that still hasn't faced an expiration. And so, to your point off the top, Franco, where, I've done a little bit of comparing to early 2020 or 2019. But what I think is most relevant right now is just look at the last 12 months. And we've continued to see what we call negative absorption. So move outs are exceeding move ins. So total occupancy is declining. It has continued to decline over the last 12 months. And part of that is the structural shift that we were talking about as companies adjust their floor plates as those pre-2020 leases expire. But part of it is we've got essentially flat office using employment growth in the last 12 months. And so those factors are combining now. Demand, as it shrinks, is concentrating largely at new construction. We'll get into this, I'm sure. There's narratives about flight to quality. I think flight to new is maybe a more apt descriptor, at least at the margins. So lease up demand is still there, but even second generation buildings are losing occupancy. There are market differences, but yeah, we're still in the midst of this shift that's kind of interacting with everything else we're seeing in commercial real estate, with higher interest rates, higher borrowing costs, the general slingshot effect in demand that we saw over the last 5 years with things like retail sales, online sales, migration of people. So all of those factors are impacting office as well. Plus there's the post 2020 way of working that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, I'm interested to hear from you too. I know you deal with a lot of occupiers. What are kind of some of the things that occupiers are looking for, and how is that kind of affecting what has a positive market and what's still struggling?
Sure. And maybe just to add to what Phil was saying. So the work that we do is with primarily occupiers within our consulting organization, but also with our investors. And no surprise, over the last 4+ years, we've gone through incredible disruption, right, on where people live, where businesses are, how work is done. And that has impacted the demand for the built environment. And I would say that organizations continue to face uncertainty, right? If you look at all of the data out there that comes out of our organization or Phil's or some of the other organizations, occupancy levels are still significantly down and in a way have remained fairly consistent for the last 12 or so months. If you look at a lot of the data around some of the bigger cities, we're still at about 50% occupancy relative to pre-pandemic levels. If you look at, say, in Chicago, the ridership on Metro is still only at 57% during the week relative to pre-pandemic levels. And so our occupier clients are looking at ways in which they can create environments, experiences that are really going to allow the work to be achieving what they want and the workers to achieve what they want. So creating some seamless experiences. And I would say that it's a bit of a test and learn at this point. So a lot of the things that Phil talked about around absorption and things like that is true. But my sense is we still have a ways to go because these big occupier clients are still trying to figure out what the future holds for them relative to how that built environment supports the work and the worker. And so, I mean, it's in a way fascinating because we've never seen this structural shift that we're seeing for the last couple of years. And I would say it's going to take not just the occupiers, it's going to take the investors, it's going to take the municipalities to come together to create something that will enable that worker and will allow them to thrive. And I hope we get to talk a little bit more about that.
Franco, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had the garbage truck coming by, of course. Drew, let's hear from you. I mean, I'm interested to hear what you have seen. Obviously, you guys, enable a lot of really interesting buildings and all over the country. What have you seen as far as what's, the state of the market and what occupiers are really interested in right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're seeing is that, I agree with Michael that occupancy rates are people occupancy versus lease occupancy rates are, anywhere between, if you take all 5 business days, you're at an average of like 33% of average building usage, space usage. But if you look at the days, like, average work in office work days are around 3 days per week. And I think that's kind of what we're settling into from a return to work on average across all industries. But we're looking at finance as an industry is coming in on the days that they're coming in, they're at 85% of the occupancy of their spaces, whereas someone like consulting is close to 60% and the legal world is around 50%. So looking at it from an industry perspective, people are using the spaces. It's just that they're not using it as often as they once were. But what we're seeing is that people also want, as they're looking at new leases, occupiers want more control over their spaces. They want to be able to create experiences that people are yearning to come back to that they don't get at home, right? So it's not, people can sit at their laptops and work at home. So what are you creating in terms of bringing people back into the office? Obviously, collaboration is a huge one, but balance collaboration with putting on your headphones and drowning out everyone else's voices instead of being at home. And so we think that, when we see, what we see a lot of is that gone are the days where landlords are like, no, you can't have any access to building systems. But now we see landlords and tenants working closer together to integrate systems. It's a very integrated and seamless experience. So everything from how do you access the building? How do you get into the building? What do you do when you're in the building? What do you do when you're in the spaces? How do you measure that? A lot of things that are happening right now is baselining and measuring what's actually happening so that we can start to help create. So Michael's groups can help create for the occupier the better experience to help drive folks back in and keep that consistent, measurable, and predictable volume for us.
Yes, some great points. And, you talked about the different industries and how I think we're starting to learn they all are they all use the office differently. And I think what has been interesting to see is, I think going into this, we kind of over-indexed maybe the commute, right? Everybody thought, oh, cities that have commutes, no one's going to want to go to the office. Cities where the commute's easy. But I don't think we've seen that, right? We see lots of cities that are not great. I wouldn't call easy commuter cities, right? Texas, has a few of them, Los Angeles, right? They are coming back to the office. I think it has more maybe to do with the industries that, are in those cities and also the culture, right? So, from what you've seen, how is that, these different cultures around the country maybe influencing the market and likewise with the different industries that are in these cities. Drew, I'll stay with you here, just, what your kind of take is on, how it affects that peak day, right? I think that's what we're learning is that peak occupancy day is really, you can't shrink the office much if you're, 85% full on that peak day.
Right. And we're seeing, quarter over quarter, we're seeing Wednesday as the peak day across every major city in the United States. And, with that, a lot of folks that are shrinking their footprint into single campuses or single, taking multiple offices, they aren't, a lot of them that haven't had the data that says, hey, I've got enough parking spots for all those that are driving so that everybody can be in on the peak day. So like measuring and understanding utilization of space, not just desks, but collaboration spaces, conference rooms, open areas, cafeteria space, cafeteria resources, even something like how many people can be in the elevator banks at the same time. Like all of these are, you're just having a very different flow of people. And I kind of going back to what you said before in terms of it's not really a city. Every city is very different, right? Every city has a city in and of itself has its own culture. And then within that, the companies have their own culture, and every industry based on how many open jobs there are, and what does the employee have in terms of kind of leverage. A lot of it comes back to the culture of the office. What I've anecdotally heard is that from a generational perspective, it's a lot of the managers, the younger folks actually want to come into buildings and come into the office because they want to learn. And it's the middle to senior management that are, that need to also return to the office in a more predictable fashion so that people can learn and be mentored. And so I think that it's a lot of policy, and then it's how do you enforce that policy within those spaces. And I think people are still really figuring that out. And we're seeing a little bit more of, I would say, confidence from companies to be able to set those policies, but yet, incorporate what employees are saying as well as what management kind of needs. And I think that the crux of it is that both parties, both sides of the equation want predictability, right? Whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and Michael, I mentioned to hear from you. I think that's a great point of the management, right? This often comes from the top down. I think there's been a lot of high profile kind of failed return to office mandates, but there are companies that I think have done a very good job. I mean, what's kind of the difference? Do you think? It's kind of been billed as a management versus worker kind of conflict, but I feel like that's a little bit missing, the nuances that are actually at play.
I think it's those that are, and this is my view from what I've been seeing with our various clients. You need a middle ground, right? Because there is this gap between leaders and what they want to achieve, and then what their workforce expects, right? The workforce expects work-life balance, well-being, being part of something that allows them to thrive, etc. And so I think it is a middle ground. When you just have a leadership mandate, right, kind of the stick, that doesn't really work. And we've seen a lot of examples, to your point, Franco, a lot of high-profile examples where it doesn't work. And then on the other end, many programs that organizations have put in place are a bit nebulous, right? You're not giving the worker enough kind of guidance or guide rails around when they should be in, why they should be in, what they should get when they are in, and then maybe how they should interact both in and outside of the built environment. And so I think it's actually kind of a middle ground. And Thru brought up a good point, right? I believe we need to listen to the workforce, to the employees, and actually be responsive. And that goes back to something I mentioned earlier around the experience, right? The experience is how people are interacting with the built environment, the services that we're providing, and things like that. And that experience could be everything from the digital experience that individuals utilize or experience. It may be the cultural experience, to the point, right, where we do see certain organizations in certain industries with incredible cultures, right, that allow the individual to immerse themselves in being part of something. And so I do think that we need to think about that kind of seamless experience that we're going to be delivering to the employee, be responsive, give them guidance on how to interact with the built environment, and enable that. And truthfully, over time, it's going to be, we're going to have to adapt. If you think about like the average tenure within organizations, right? It's sub 5 years. So think about that. We're what, 50 months since the beginning of the pandemic. So in many organizations, the average tenure, people weren't part of the organization pre-pandemic. So what they've experienced is virtual work, hybrid work, learning the organization and things like that. And so we have to transition the employee and move forward. And that may not, it likely will not be what we experienced previously, but we do know the office is the center of work, right? It's the heart of the organization, and it does play a role in organizations doing the things they need to do. And so that would be my kind of guidance from where we've seen it really work well. It's kind of that balance.
Mm-hmm. Phil, you have anything to add to kind of what we're seeing play out as far as what people actually want from the office?
Well, I think it's one reason why we're seeing this congregation of tenants in new construction, because that offers them the chance, in some cases just out of the box. These modern buildings are conducive to all the things that people want to enhance the workplace: natural light, high air quality, activity-based programming of the space, and along with all the fit and finish that goes along with that. So that's definitely part of it. I think the other piece is, if you look at just market level return to office rates as measured by things like transit, as Michael alluded to, or building access systems, or even surveys, those actually don't correlate terribly strongly to what we've seen in office demand metrics. I think there are some explanations for that. Leases are long term, so they're not going to react terribly quickly to movement in those indicators. That's the biggest thing. But more broadly, there are some factors that do seem to be related. So one of them is cost of living. If you look at where apartment rents or home values or household incomes are high versus low, it's not a perfect relationship, but the higher the cost of living, then the worse the office market tends to perform in a city. And I think the commute is a piece of that, but especially if the commute is to a CBD via public transit. So, you mentioned, Franco, Dallas or Houston or even a place like Atlanta, where there's reasonable resilience to office demand in places like that. And part of it is because the office market is spread out. It's not as concentrated there as it is in, say, Manhattan or San Francisco. Part of it is because of the way people get around in those cities is by car, typically, to a greater extent than by public transit. So cost of living is a factor that is, I think, related to how far away you live and how you get around. I think the distribution of the labor force is another big factor in all this. And it's a little simplistic to say, well, if you've got exposure to a lot of tech companies, then that's not great for your office market. But it's true. And I think there's a couple factors there. One is the tech companies are the ones that tend to be more leading the way in terms of workplace flexibility. I think even bigger is the fact that they're the ones that overconsumed office in the late 2010s. They were growing headcount 20-30% a year, and they were growing their real estate footprints, often with the assumption that they'll put it on the sublease market and lease it to a startup for a few years. Well, now you've got a situation where they actually did grow their employee count for a time, but now it stopped growing. So they've got space that they're not using. And then the double whammy is, well, that startup environment, with venture capital funding coming back now, but having dried up in the wake of rising interest rates, those startups, they're conserving costs. They're using whatever funding they have left to just fund operations. They're not going out and subleasing space. So on both sides of these highly tech-oriented markets, both the kind of primary and secondary demand and supply sides, you've got weakness there that I think is tangentially related, but not directly related to just the sheer level of attendance.
Mm-hmm. I have an interesting question here I want to throw at you guys, which is, are you seeing a different approach regarding the return to office with users in different size ranges? I think they're talking about the organization size, not the actual people themselves. But I think that's an interesting point, right? Are larger companies more likely to, have the resources to push into the office through? I'm interested to hear from you. I know you guys track a lot of this data.
So I think the mandates are oftentimes coming from the larger companies, but the enforcement is pretty low on those companies because there's, it's a risk reward decision, right, for those companies to say, okay, what am I going to do if somebody doesn't follow the mandate? We have seen some companies say that we will affect bonuses, year-end bonuses to that adherence to the policy. But what we see from a numbers perspective is that it's actually the mid-size lease size, like not company size, but like the leases that are, somewhere between 5 and 10,000, 15,000 square feet are the ones actually that have higher occupancy rates, because that collaboration part of the smaller offices coming together is bigger. And it depends on how graphically distributed the team is too, right? So if everyone is distributed across the United States and you have one person from a marketing team in Chicago and then others in Atlanta and California, there's no purpose of the office from a collaboration perspective. So it is, I think it's a factor of what is your geographic distribution and representation of teams. Do you have kind of concentration of cross collaboration in a market, and then the size of your lease, and then your policy, how people are adhering to policy or not. So it's not a here's a formula. I think it's a factor of all of those. And Michael, I might be missing a few that you might contribute more to, but
yeah, I think you're right. Through it's industry, it's geography, it's size, it's the culture. You could even pull it back to how old the company is, right? A lot of companies, more, that have been around for hundreds of years, the way they work has continued, right? And then maybe the other thing that could come into play is how disrupted did they take work during the beginning of the pandemic, right? There's certain geographies within the United States that didn't have some of the strict mandates around working from home, right? And you see that in a lot of the southern, or like the Texas cities, where they didn't force people to work from home, the municipalities, et cetera. And I think actually that has an impact on it as well. Your point about scale, though, Franco, is your ability to impact, your ability to make decisions at scale, right? And the right decisions. And there's, certain smaller mid-sized organizations that are just highly agile. They're highly nimble to be able to adjust and create the environment that allows the organization and the worker to thrive. And so I think it depends on a whole lot of things. And that's the problem, right? It's not a one size fits all. It's not a silver bullet. And that's why it goes back to before, you kind of have to test and learn and be responsive. And that goes back to a lot of the data that Through is capturing, right? How work is being done in the built environment, what things are actually being utilized, how are people navigating in the space. All of those things should help inform what you as an organization do to be responsive, right? And that's, I think, is really important.
I think, Michael, just to add to that, it's also like if you look at the building as a whole, like what do you do to activate a building? You have to look at the tenant type mix, like what industries are they from? Like which ones need to socialize more to build business, like your services companies versus some of your tech companies that might have a high concentration of product engineering and or marketing folks that are more internally focused. And a lot of
Yep.
people are coming to the office to collaborate, not what we did when I started my career 20 years ago, which was we came to the office to go to that happy hour after work, right? That's just, it's a very different way of working today. And I think it's really understanding the type of people that are in your building and those that you're trying to attract.
Yeah. Yeah, I think smaller organizations tend to be a little bit flatter hierarchies too, right? And I think
Yeah.
that probably gives them a lot more understanding, right, of what, what everybody from the top to the bottom really wants and needs. So I got another question here. Actually, we have this earmarked for later in the conversation, but we can go ahead and jump into it now, right? Which specific amenities are you seeing or anticipating that will make buildings more desirable, right? There's lots of like empty gyms and a lot of money spent on amenities that probably doesn't move the needle, but I think there are some that do. I want to hear your stance on this too, because I know we've had a couple conversations about this.
So I think there's two questions within that because I never answer a question just directly, but the two questions are what amenities do you need to lease? And then what amenities are actually used? And I think those are very different questions. Unfortunately, they're not the same, but they should be the same. And so I will answer what are people actually desiring in spaces when they're in there? The utilization of amenities, 62% of 62% of all people coming to buildings use digital amenities, whereas they only use 20%. 20% of people coming into buildings use the physical amenities in a building space. So digital and technology is the way to go, because again, if we think about what is the biggest reason people are coming to the office, it's for collaboration. And so to make it seamless to collaborate with the people that they're coming in to see, to be more productive, these are all the tooling that they want. You're seeing that, in terms of actual amenity spaces that are being used, the large conference spaces, the big gathering spaces are still the biggest. We're seeing outdoor amenity spaces are still under, 5% utilization. While people want it, I think that, it's also hard to track if you don't have occupancy sensing or if they're not reservable. So just take that with a grain of salt. But what we really are seeing is that it's the collaboration spaces that people are wanting. And is the AV connected to is AV connected? Is it easy to connect? Is it easy to bring in other virtual people into this space? Is it comfortable from a temperature perspective, or am I going to freeze? Is the indoor air quality, is it actually good, or am I going to fall asleep if 10 people are sitting in a room together and CO2 levels go up? So all of those things that, a lot of people that are running buildings never really wanted to address are the things that I think are the new amenities or the old amenities that people want to control now. So that's what I think.
Michael, what are you seeing something similar? What's your take?
Yeah, I totally agree with Drew. I would characterize it as, because it's interesting. You probably got a response from Drew that was a little different, right? You're looking for who's got foosball versus
Right.
pool tables
Kombucha, beer
versus the
kegs.
gym, right? It's what I think works is it's frictionless for the employee, right? And those amenities are meant to allow the employee to be able to navigate freely, right? Technology is critically important. It could be as simple as how they navigate, the employee and the guests navigate through like lobbies, right? And with security, concierges and things like that. So you're trying to, and that's where those are being highly utilized, right? Those things that enable that frictionless. The other is, you need to think about what the value prop is for the employee, your employees, or your tenants, right? To the point earlier about industries and things like that, you know, if the demographic of the tenant or the employee is one that are parents and things like that, they're probably looking for more amenities that help them so they don't have to be out of the office, you know, dry cleaning, things like that. And so I think my takeaway is you really need to understand the needs and wants of the employees, the tenants, and then create those amenities. But the easy ones are those that allow the employees and the tenants to be able to navigate, right? How they enter the building, how they operate within the built environment, how they leave, right? It could be as simple as, you know, in your parking structures, you know, the last thing you want is an employee to create them, or the tenant to have anxiety because they have to go 10 levels and every level is empty or is full, and then there's space. They don't know that, right? So it's those kind of technologies and cues that allow kind of the anxiety level to come down, allows people to kind of navigate freely. And then depending on the value prop, you start to then dial in maybe some of the more curated amenities that are important, like food, or like, you know, daycare, or like gyms and things like that.
Mhm. I'm
But
gonna
you
throw
really want to create something people want to be part of, right?
absolutely.
The culture of the organization and the culture, if you will, of that built environment.
I'm going to throw in another piece here that often isn't talked about, but at what point is location an amenity, right? I know, like, you know, anecdotally, I hear a lot of younger people, like, I think that they are a lot less excited about the kind of in-office happy hours, right? What they want to do is go out to the bar next door, or like go around the city, right? Especially if you're a hybrid work, you work from home a lot of the time. You know, Phil, in a past life, was actually a researcher for us here at PropMoto, and I remember we did um, a report about suburban offices, right? I think when the pandemic hit, everybody thought, well, since the commute is obviously the thing that is going to, you know, keep people from the office, suburban office is going to just, you know, go crazy. And I think, you know, Phil made a stance against that, which I think actually played out to be right, which is, you know, a lot of suburban office stock is not the kind that, you know, you want. And also you're losing that location amenity, right? You're probably somewhere that isn't exactly exciting to go, right? There might be a strip mall next door or a food truck, but it's not like going to a central business. So Phil, I'll start with you on this one because I want to hear your piece. But like, how important is location and what's, you know, directly around a building, you know, to the market?
I think it's crucial, and it means something different depending on where you are. So, for example, in Manhattan, it matters how far away you are from an avenue, right? So if you're mid-block between 5th and 6th, that's maybe less advantageous than if you're between Lex and Park.
Mhm.
So it can get that fine grain. And if you're literally on top of a transit station, like for example, the Peru Center here in Boston, where maybe you don't even have to exit the building in order to get up into your office. I think that matters, especially on a day like today when I was commenting to you as we were pre-gaming this that I got soaked on my walk from the train station because it was not only raining but windy, and so the rain's coming in sideways, and so I think amenities like that type of location matter. I think on the other hand, if you're going more suburban, then you know the mixed use kind of micro urban environment, you know, not suburban the way that we might have thought about it 15 or 20 years ago, where it's you know, a big landscaped campus with 3 5-story buildings and that's it. But more of the, hey, there's a strip of restaurants here and maybe some shops. There's an apartment building over there and a hotel, and oh yeah, and here's our office tower, right? So it's got enough parking. It's got things to do other than just be at the office. You can go downstairs to one of 3 or 4 restaurants for the happy hour instead of staying in the building. So I think location from that standpoint is an amenity depending on what part of town you are. And our data has shown that essentially the lower the concentration of office within a commercial district. So in other words, if office makes up a smaller share of the total commercial space around, then that office performs better. And so if you have, a CBD or a several block area where it's just offices, 80-90% of the square footage, it's a retail desert or a hospitality desert, then that office is not going to perform as well. So that's another way that I think, location itself is an amenity.
Interesting. And it just goes to show how, these office conversions, especially retail conversion or residential conversions, can change the face of an area too, right? Because you're kind of reducing the office stock plus adding, all of the other great things that come with it, right? People living.
Yeah, and you gotta think about what retail needs to go there, right? Because the retail mix needs to be different, because 5-10 years ago you had retail that was office dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're quite there yet, but we could get to a place where, if you take an area like downtown Nashville, you might have office that's retail dependent, right? And so you need to think about orienting that retail differently, particularly if you've got a higher concentration of, say, residents, if you convert some buildings, than, daily visitors. You need different kinds of retail. Think more Whole Foods and less, Potbelly.
Mm-hmm. Michael, do you have anything to add, just as far as, the location and the importance of that when it comes to occupiers today?
Yeah, what's interesting is, and Phil somewhat alluded to this, there are submarkets in almost every major city that are overperforming, right? And you talk about flight to quality or flight to new, right? That could mean everything from being in a very unique building, but in the heart of where life and retail and work happens, or it could be in a brand new location. I think organizations, at least from an occupier perspective, there's a somewhat of a realization that the old notion of kind of build it and they will come isn't necessarily true anymore, right? And so where you locate should be in an environment that allows people to access it, to want to be part of it, et cetera. And so that may be being in new locations where we're seeing a lot of demand for talent, technology talent, AI talent, or particular other innovative roles. Or it may be within the particular part of a city, like you see in Chicago, a lot of really high demand for some of the submarkets in West Loop and places like that, where that does have that mix that Phil is alluding to around live, work, the play, etc., and less within the loop or the CBD. And I think that's where we see our municipalities and our developers, et cetera, kind of rethinking the traditional kind of CBD just being for office, right? And I think it go back to something you said earlier, we were talking about, which is kind of return to office. If you study some of the cities in Europe, right, that are very old cities, those are live, work, play, right? Paris, places like that, Madrid, those are, and you see occupancy levels pretty high, right? And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the organizations do kind of respond to locations being really in a place that accesses and enables the workforce.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pivot here for a second because I just want to make sure to talk a little bit about the data, right? I think that one of the huge shifts that we have seen is that, landlords now are kind of acting as a bit of a data partner for organizations, right? Where they have to help, understand their workforce, understand the needs of the office place, right? And so, I'm interested to hear how this data is being shared, right? How this kind of new relationship is working out, where you're a bit of kind of like a business partner in a way, instead of just someone that collects rent checks and changes locks when you get out. Through obviously you're dealing with this every day. Like, what do you think as you've seen this kind of cultural shift of how landlords are dealing with their tenants?
In a lot of the buildings that we're in are trophy buildings, and there's a lot of active kind of tenant to landlord coordination where they're meeting with their tenants on an ongoing basis and talking about usage of amenities, the visitor, like how many visitors are actually using the space, how many service tickets are outstanding, and what's been the average time to close. All of those are hospitality elements that I don't think just putting an extra person at the base of the building is going to solve, other problems if they have those. So we do see active kind of conversations, like almost like if a tech company had a customer success organization, landlords are creating that role to have that with their tenants, right? Tenant coordinators, coordination management. It's getting more into that service level without being able to add any more people. And so you're starting to see a bit of a shift of who's actually managing the buildings, and technology allows them to be able to shift that, right? Versus like doing a bunch of manual tasks that can be digitized. So from a sharing perspective, a lot of tenants still ask for what was key card swipes, and landlords have it, if you don't have a solution that will clean the data, that a lot of access control systems don't have clean data, right? So it has to be cleaned, it has to be structured, it has to be normalized. You got to take out all this data that's junk. And so landlords do have a more difficult time handing over that data, or they hand over data that's not very useful. So we're seeing that relationship is getting better, and that people are sharing more, but it's mostly around kind of occupancy and utilization of space between the landlord and then the tenant. But a lot of smart building platforms like our own can be extended into the tenant space, so you can get both levels of data. So we're seeing a shift in how people are collecting that data, and then what decisions are being made off of that data itself.
I got an interesting question here that I'm going to follow up with you on through is, how obviously like here's what's happening in this office right now. And then there's like a larger piece of like, well, here's your full office footprint, right? The question is, you're seeing data indicating more of a distributed office model, right? Going away from large multi-floor offices to smaller distributed, offices across the region. And I guess my like tweak of that question is that something that landlords are providing too, where it's not just like, hey, your conference room is getting used X amount of times, but maybe like, hey, of your entire office portfolio, right, you could maybe, distribute some of it here and there, like the kind of a more holistic conversation about the like office footprint.
Yeah, not necessarily, because remember, the landlord doesn't go into the tenant spaces, right? So they don't have an understanding of what conference rooms are being used by that tenant. That's the tenant's responsibility. Now, we are seeing a little bit of those services being offered in single tenant, smaller office buildings, especially in the Bay Area, as you're trying to get more tech clients. And we're seeing some, very forward thinking owners trying to position it that way, right? We can get you the data so that you can start to look at the utilization of space. But in multi-tenanted buildings, that is the responsibility of the tenant themselves. What the landlord can provide is, here's the use of the common amenity spaces, or here's the use of parking, or here's how many people are coming in and swiping in at that base building system. If you have an access control system at all, right? Not all markets have that either. So it's dependent. And then it also depends on, what's your IoT strategy and sensor strategy, although that won't tell you who, it'll tell you how many. So there's a whole bunch of different strategies that people have, but the landlord isn't sharing here's how you should use your space and here's what you should do in your space. That's really a occupier
More
side
of an
strategy.
occupier. Sure, that makes sense. I wanted to touch on a question here that I thought was a good one. It's just about, obviously we've talked about there's a lot of amenities that people want, right? These newer offices tend to have them just because they are built, in this technological age. But, older offices can adopt the technology. Obviously, there is a investment needed for that. So the question here is, are landlords and tenants willing to pay the increase in costs to create these kind of, more, unique spaces? I know tenant improvement allowances have always been big. I've heard they're on the rise, but a lot of office owners are probably a little strapped for cash, right? Might not have a bunch of money to hand out to, get all these kind of new technology in. So what are you guys seeing as far as how this is playing out? Who's paying for it? Are they willing to, or are some people just, is it prohibitively expensive? Bill, I know you guys track tenant improvement stuff, so let's start with you.
Yeah. So I think this is another factor that is sending tenants to new construction, because those, if a newer building is going to be relatively well capitalized, probably that's how it got built. And so the tenants can get the best of both worlds there, especially given that many of them are taking less space. So I've seen a couple of the questions talk about, consolidating space or smaller locations versus larger ones. There just are not many of those big multi-floor requirements out in the market now. And even large organizations, they're tending to take less space than they did. And so the trade-off that they're able to make then is they can take the savings that they're obtaining by taking less space, and they can put that into the space, right? They can put in technology, they can put in programming, they can contribute to building out the space, which many of them are doing. And so that's, again, concentrating in new construction, right? So I think the short answer is yes, some organizations are willing to pay for it, but they may not be increasing their occupancy costs in the absolute because they're trimming their footprints. Now, the other nuance to this, and this surprises people, is that your sort of low B class office, it's not that it's performing well, but it's actually not as bad as kind of your commodity class A property. And I think the reason for that is that's the segment of the tenant market that already wasn't willing to pay extra for stuff like this, right? They're already price sensitive. That's how they're acquiring space. They're looking at the space as an opportunity to park their workers, which is fine. But like another one of the questions addressed this notion of supplying what people can't get elsewhere, which very often is a quiet place to do your work, right? And a class B office does that just fine. So if your workforce needs that more than anything else, then you can get that at a pretty good rate right now. And if you're a landlord who's stuck in the middle, right? I've got a 20-year-old nominally class A building. I can't really compete with the One Vanderbilts of the world in the brand new trophy space. On the other hand, my capital structure doesn't allow me to drop rents to compete with the class B stuff that's maybe, across town or down the block. Well, that's the stuff that's really been bleeding occupancy, because, you've got, on the one hand, organizations that are willing to pay to get that bespoke workplace, and on the other hand, organizations that are price sensitive and are looking for efficiency. And if you're stuck in the middle, it's a difficult place to be.
Can I also add to that? So I think, when we talk about the costs, I think because technology is newer, the whole cost conversation has to also be had, right, around technology costs. Tech costs are buried in CAM and OpEx, and it's never talked about on its own as a separate piece. And so we've encouraged, and some of our clients and landlords will separate out the costs and say, this is the cost for smart controls, right? For temperature controls, for indoor air quality monitoring. Some tech companies will split the cost for inside of tenant spaces to be able to go into those spaces. So I think it's less about whether people will absorb it. I think it's more about the creativity around how do you position the cost itself, right? Because tech costs are increasing. That doesn't mean that you position it as a labor cost or an OPEX cost, right? You position it as its own cost and you say, are you willing to pay this smart controls cost or this, added technology cost? On the occupier side, right? One of the things that I think we'll start to see over the next, 2 to 5 years is that these workplace applications that includes the physical space utilization aren't going to be viewed as real estate occupancy costs. They'll probably be viewed as enterprise, per user costs, because these are enterprise applications, right? So I think that because it was so separated in how accounting kind of accounts for real estate costs, we need to start thinking about it very differently. And you're talking about tech costs that are cents on the dollar versus, leasing costs, which are dollars, tens of dollars per year. And so it's just, I think honestly, it's a training of how to talk about technology.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add, Franco, is from a landlord's perspective, I would use it as an opportunity to position your particular environment, right? Because and Phil got into this a little bit, right? We're seeing a massive slowdown on new project starts. No surprise, right? In 21, 22. And most of the product that is coming online is already pre-leased. And if you think about the occupiers, especially here in the United States, almost every one of them have, I'll call them long-term goals around carbon emission reduction, right? They're also struggling with, getting people back into the office. A lot of these technologies actually help to drive greater efficiencies, create a better experience, all of these things. And the things that you have from a landlord perspective are opportunities to help that occupier client, right? And we talk about, mentioned earlier, the flight to quality. That quality space, that's where all the absorption is today. And that's going to go away if we don't have new product coming on. So repositioning your particular assets and then using things like technology as an opportunity to attract tenants, I think is a good strategy to have, because differentiating is going to be really important.
Yeah. Technology is expensive unless you look at the cost of an empty building, right? Like
Exactly. I mean, if you think about how like generative AI and other things are impacting, having data and models, et cetera, that allow us to operate more efficiently, to be more predictive, is really, really important. And so data is going to be important. The technology that allows us to interpret the data and then to be able to react is going to be really, really important going forward.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we are going to have to leave it there. We're at the top of the hour. I know there's a bunch of questions that came up that we didn't get to. I apologize for that. I will be able to connect anyone here with our, participants if they would like. You can feel free to email me at franco@propmoto.com. That's FRANCO @propmoto.com. And I can do my best to put you in contact with any of these intelligent people here. Thank you all for joining. I think this has been really great. And obviously, this debate is not settled, right? This is going to be an ongoing thing where we have to, think about the office occupancy and what people want from the office going forward. So hopefully we will have another one of these in the near future. Through Michael, Phil, thank you guys so much and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.